Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today at our every fortnight KHA webinar where we discuss issues pertaining to African problems and climate change. So today we have got Professor David Hughes and Professor KHA that are going to be in conversation on a book written by Professor David Hughes. Professor David Hughes, do you want to introduce yourself in ways that you feel comfortable with?
Sure, I'm happy to do that, Josh, and thank you and Kirk for inviting me to the program. I got my start, I would say, in Southern Africa many years ago as an undergraduate in the U.S. in the anti-apartheid movement in the early 80s. And that made me extremely interested in frontline states and Zimbabwe in particular. So I worked for a number of NGOs after college. And then went to graduate school, and did a pretty applied dissertation on what at that point was discussed as the Chimanimani Transfrontier Conservation Area. Half of my work was in Mozambique as well. And I was in that circle of the Center for Applied Social Sciences who were providing support, evaluation, and often criticism of the Campfire program in community-based natural resource management. And that work led rather naturally in the course of the 90s to discussions of land reform. The work that we'll be discussing today came out of a USAID-funded project that I led in the very early 2000s, trying to evaluate the longitudinal effects of the fast-track land reform program and to suggest some kinds of compromises whereby commercial farmers could still provide pack sheds and other kinds of support to middle scale and small scale resettled farmers. None of that happened. So I wrote two books about Zimbabwe, essentially. And then I've moved on more recently to other countries where the government would allow me to carry out research and research more focused on climate change, in fact. So I wrote a book, an ethnography of the petroleum industry in Trinidad and Tobago called Energy Without Conscience. And recently I wrote a book about the politics of wind farms in Spain called Who Owns the Wind? But my heart is very much in Zimbabwe, and so I'm very happy to talk about this work with you today.
That's okay. Thank you so much, David. And Kik, do you want to introduce yourself?
My name is Kirk Kelleker. I'm a sociologist at Rhodes University in South Africa, where I also have for a number of years run a unit of Zimbabwean studies, doing my own research and supervising a number of PhD candidates on Zimbabwe. Thank you.
That's okay. Thanks very much. So today we have Kik and David in conversation about the book that David wrote on Zimbabwe. Over to you, Kik and David.
Thank you. Thank you, Joshua, for introducing the session. And David, thank you so much for joining us. So we're going to be dealing with, as David mentioned, he's written two books on Zimbabwe. The second one, which came out in 2010, is entitled Whiteness in Zimbabwe and subtitled Race, Landscape, and the Problem of Belonging. So in a sense, it fits into a diverse array of literature, studies on whiteness, but also studies around landscape and belonging. And it focuses on two empirical case studies, one on Kariba, the construction of Kariba Dam, and the ways in which white people use the dam and the waterscape around Kariba as a basis for belonging to Zimbabwe, or to then Rhodesia. And then the second case study looks at a group of white commercial farmers in Virginia, east of Harare, post-1980. And their building of dams, of irrigation schemes, and the ways in which they also use that as a basis for making sort of claims to being part of the Zimbabwean nation and citizens of the country. So it's arguments about belonging in relation to waterscapes more generally, with specific reference to Kariba and the white commercial farming sector. And David, it's of interest to both Joshua and myself. I'm sure the water audience. Kariba is quite a central issue in the past of Zimbabwe, but also contemporary in terms of hydropower, with the lack thereof coming from Kariba currently. And also white commercial farmers continue to be a nagging issue in the history of Zimbabwe, and also in terms of what has taken place since the year 2000. So it really is interesting to me as well. I lived in Zimbabwe from 1993 to 2007 in Shamba, Matepetepe, just north of Bindura in Mashonaland Central. And I lived amongst the white commercial farmers during those years, though not a white commercial farmer myself, working for NGOs in the area. And I do recollect quite vividly the white commercial farmers, often during school holidays when the kids are back from school, traveling quite far to Kariba to spend their holidays in Kariba. So there is that sort of empirical connection between the white commercial farmers and Kariba as well. In terms of the overall argument of your book, I just want to read from the earlier part of the book, where you indicate, and this is a quotation, many whites chose almost consciously to negotiate their identity with land forms or landscape rather than social forms, including the Black population itself. And they did so by, that's end of quotation, and they did so by imagining the Black population away and crafting an ideal of white settler as nature, lover, and conservationist. So the sense in which Kariba Dam as a human construction and the dams on white commercial farms and irrigation schemes as being human constructions as well, somehow being depicted as nature, and whites trying to claim a sense of belonging to the natural landscape as such of Zimbabwe or Rhodesia, and in doing so, depicting the Black population as almost not being of any significance in terms of mediating their belonging to Africa. So that if that's if that's not an accurate reflection, please correct me. But if we could just use that as a context, first of all, for discussing Kariba, what your argument is about Kariba, and then after that to go on to the argument about what you say about white commercial farmers and belonging. So if you could just start with Kariba, that would be really appreciated. Thank you, David.
Yeah, sure, Kirk. Thank you. You summarized that part of the book extremely well. So what I would say, just to back up a tiny bit, is that in the book I'm describing what I call the imaginative project of white identity or white belonging in this part of Africa. And I'm distinguishing that imaginative project from what I call an administrative project. So that whites, especially under Rhodesian rule, were in charge of all kinds of administrative things, which involved managing, governing, exploiting Black Africans. And there was all of that going on, much less after 1980, of course, but still going on the commercial farms as small little fiefdoms. So that administrative project was happening. That didn't really, though, capture the imagination of many whites. And I have to be careful here, too. The book has been criticized, and rightly to some extent, of lumping rather than splitting the white population.
Yeah.
And the white population was very disparate as far as the administrative project goes. I mean, even under Rhodesian rule, most whites were not ruling things. Most whites were actually in the cities, even at that point, and were getting by in various ways and didn't own a lot of land. What tended more to unite whites of all classes and backgrounds was this imaginative project. And this imaginative project, as you just said, meant establishing your sense of belonging in Africa because you had some kind of unique relationship as a population, a unique relationship with landforms and wild species. And that involved, as you just said, imagining blacks away in this kind of utopian idea of man and nature. And so the funny thing, though, is that none of this was easy. There were all sorts of contradictions that the writer or the photographer or the painter, give a lot of emphasis to the arts in that half of the book. Those people had to overcome a lot of contradictions. And the biggest one was that what whites were doing on the farms was transforming the landscape. They were replacing nature through their own investments in cropping, in contours, and other kinds of soil management, eventually in farm dams. They were really transforming the landscape into some kind of very productive agro-industrial second nature.
Yeah.
And all that accorded with the values of the 1950s, 60s, maybe 70s, and much earlier, in terms of the colonial desire to improve the landscape. However, by the time you get to the 80s and especially the 90s, there's a turn towards conservation, and values then accrue to not transforming, but preserving the landscape.
Yeah.
So how can this population, which identified itself as the improver of the landscape, then turn very quickly to identifying itself as the preserver of the landscape?
Yeah.
That's rather tough. And it was actually some of the kind of mythology, which is, again, I think a kind of a British-derived mythology about water. The mythology about water helped people overcome that contradiction. And much more so in Kariba than any place else. So this is where, sorry, it's taking a while to get to your question. So Kariba is remarkable, of course, because at the time it was, and I think still, unless you count this kind of extension of Lake Victoria, the largest reservoir in the world by surface area. Of course, in a landscape that has no natural lakes. And I always thought of it actually as the kind of whitest landscape in Zimbabwe because of the values and the making of it. So it starts and conceptualized in the late 50s as an incredible industrial technological project. And I followed this through the literature, and I interviewed all the living writers too, who were all whites, who'd written about Kariba. And there was a sense of guilt as soon as the reservoir filled. Not really guilt about, the 57,000 displaced Tonga, some of whose descendants are actually in the background of Joshua's screen right now. Whites weren't particularly guilty about that in the literature I read, but they were guilty about all the animals displaced, the animals that died, the plants that died. Because of the scale of this dam, the surface area of this dam, basically it kills everything that can't move when you flood a reservoir for the first time. There won't be hydrophilic plants there. So a new reservoir creates total destruction more than a nuclear bomb would over the same area. And so people had to redeem that. The white writers had to redeem that, and they redeemed it through conservation on the shoreline, through all of these protected areas, which pushed the Tonga still further away from where they were born and denied them access to much of the resources of the lakeshore. And then through the sheer pleasure of having a seascape to go to on holiday and fish in and so on. So the Kariba then, in the most extreme way, as the kind of leading edge, allowed whites to negotiate belonging again twice with the landscape. First on the grounds of improvement, and second on the grounds of stewardship.
Yeah. Okay. And in this situation with regard to the white commercial farmers, is that a similar argument, or is there a variation of different arguments?
Well, so water. There's part of it is similar. I looked a lot at the waterscape created, and I was working in the Virginia area, doing ethnography in the Virginia farming area of Mashonaland East. you know, a little bit south of Shamba and so on. And I was interested in all of the water resources. And there's a material applied side to that and a side to that which fits very much in the book. You know, when fast track and the land invasions began, and even all through the 90s, and I was involved in some of these debates about land reform at a policy level, people didn't think very much about water resources. And that's partly because water resources were such a moving target. In the 1990s, white commercial farmers made a huge investment in farm dams for irrigation. And what I believe, based on my ethnography, is they did this for two reasons. The first was, of course, it was profitable to get a second crop or even a third crop in the rotation per year through the dry season. But the second reason was that it represented a way of holding on to land, because of course the government was saying we'll compensate you for investments, not for the land itself, but for investments. So commercial farmers wanted to make that compensation expensive, and they invested a lot. It ended up backfiring because then they lost all their investments. So those were the reasons for building farm dams. And then, there was, in terms of this imaginative project, a dividend, a cultural dividend, which is that the farms became beautiful. You know, again, because of this mythology of water, the farms had all of this shoreline, which was then often further enhanced through small, intricate developments of pools and peninsulas for fishing and things. And all of that shoreline provided habitat, and according to some of my subjects, increased the bird life and the avifauna diversity, all this kind of stuff. Unclear whether that's true. But in any case, the farm dams, which had been about irrigation and production, became, in the imagination, a project of stewardship and conservation. And so whites could say, kind of in the morning, I own this land and should own this land because I can produce more maize and more tobacco here than anybody, particularly than the black elites or the black poor people who want the land from me. Say that in the morning. In the afternoon, they could say, I own this land and I deserve this land because I can preserve the birds and the wildlife and the entire beautiful nature of it better than anybody else. And that contradiction, actually, the farm dams finessed that contradiction, let's say.
Okay, now that's interesting. And look, it's been some time since I've read your book, so I can't remember the specific details of many of your arguments. But I mean, in terms of, and I'm thinking specifically of the white commercial farmers, there is certainly an origin story in South Africa, possibly in Zimbabwe as well, about how, well, even white settlers, broadly speaking, found the lands empty on their arrival. And in terms of the white commercial farmers, they built their land, or they built their agricultural project specifically and exclusively because of their own blood, sweat, and tears, as if they had no help from their black laborers. So I'm just wondering whether the imaginative project, as you presented, is in any way related to these origin stories of white emplacement in Africa and the development of the white commercial farming sector specifically.
Yeah, well, that story is imagined in many cases, and certainly is part of, undergirds the notion that a commercial farmer, and this thing is very gendered, so it's usually a commercial farmer negotiating his identity directly with the landscape, where black people are not present. It's an empty landscape. You know, my first book, which came out in 2007, entitled From Enslavement to Environmentalism, Politics on a Southern African Frontier, looks at the history of the Chimani. I'm in Chimani Mani district at that point in the Eastern Highlands. And you know, you go through the archive and you find remarkable statements like the Moody's, the Moody trek led by Thomas Moody got there in 1893, coming up from South Africa. The first native commissioner got there in 1897, and he was actually quite concerned about the fate of African smallholders. And he began immediately to try to set up native reserves, which would be where land alienation by whites would be interdicted. And what he wrote is, and I can remember this one particular phrase verbatim, thickly settled. He said that the Moody's and their colleagues chose for their own farms the areas that were most thickly settled with Africans. And the reason they did that is that they wanted labor. You know, I don't think very many of these white family farms actually opened the fields and prepared the land and fences and everything else that they did and built houses. I don't think they did it in their own blood, sweat, and tears. They needed people to work for them. And most of the Africans were not interested in working for them. And so what the commercial farmers did, that was before you could really call them commercial farmers. They were settlers or pioneers or frontiersmen or whatever. They established a land title. They declared themselves to be owners. They declared the occupants to be tenants. And they said, as you know, in lieu of rent, you can pay us in days of work. So this was a form of unfree labor. And that's what actually happened. I mean, that's the origin of the administrative project, if you want to call it that. But, you know, by the time I was doing the field work among commercial farmers, they no longer identified with that history at all. And the truth of the matter is the big influx of whites, Europeans into agriculture came after World War II with land grants that ex-soldiers got in the 50s.
Yeah. Okay, no, thank you about that. So I'm just wondering, as an imaginative projects, or the two projects you mentioned, I mean, to what extent or to what extent were whites secure in that imaginative project as having, I mean, did they actually feel a secure sense of belonging? Or is it something which they had doubts about? Did they feel that they actually did belong? Or were there certain uncertainties regarding that?
Yeah, so this is a fascinating question. I mean, the comparative side of this research is that I'm interested in how such a small, in a sense, precarious population could feel the sense of belonging and entitlement to the extent that it did. You know, in the United States, and maybe this is similar in Australia, the core nation is composed, the core in terms of ideology and power and so on, the core nation is composed of people descended from Europe. So much so that, as you probably know, in the US, we have right-wing movements that declare themselves to be native, that the natives are Europeans, forgetting entirely about the indigenous presence, which is still here. But, you know, maybe that's less surprising because whites are at this point a little bit more than 50% of the population, and prior to and a few decades ago were more like 75 or 80% of the population in the US, and I think the even higher number in Australia maybe. But so what's surprising is that in Zimbabwe, where whites were never more than 5%, and by the time I started this research in 2000 were below 1%, why they should feel such a sense of entitlement. Right, and that's the other question. If we take it away from land and away from European settlement, it's how the incredibly wealthy and privileged person feels not only greedy, but feels comfortable in that greed. I'm thinking about people like Elon Musk and billionaires and so on. How do you insulate yourself from the doubt or the fear or the insecurity of needy people, deserving people all around you? I'm straying a little bit from your question here. Oh, did whites, commercial farmers feel doubts in their sense of belonging? Yeah, I mean, the flip side is that they did feel to some extent uneasy. And this came up by the time I started my field work in 2000 for this book for whiteness in Zimbabwe. The state was against these people and was killing some of them and killing a lot of the farm workers, and they definitely felt uneasy. My experience before that, when I was doing field work in Chimanimani, I would come into Chimanimani, the district center, now and then, and Chipinge too, and I would run into whites at you know, where would I, the Chimanimani Hotel, places like that, and they'd say, "Oh, you're that anthropologist down in Vimba. We're so glad there's an anthropologist studying our blacks, and studying the natives and so on." And really, you know, can you tell me something? They'd actually want to know something from me, and it was in fact in some ways endearing. They'd say, you know, this word Chimanimani, what does it mean? And they didn't actually want me to tell them. They just wanted me to confirm their own belief. And they had various beliefs that it had to do with the mountain ranges, which kind of form a set of 2 or 3 ridges running north to south. They had various theories about what Chimanimani meant that they wanted me to confirm for them. And this was the district where they lived. And they were not people who spoke Shona, which is another striking thing, is that language competence, as a settler population, language competence among white Zimbabweans was always quite low. Lower, in fact, than, say, whites in Kenya, many of whom learned Swahili, and it actually got lower over time in Zimbabwe. But anyway, so these people just wanted confirmation of this Shona word. And I had to explain that, you know, you don't have any idea. Chimanimani is a Nyahuzo Singwe. It's an idiophone, and it refers to the sound of something passing through a narrow passage. So it could be the wind that's going through between these 2 mountain ranges. It could be you walking along a pathway where the grass is high and there's a sort of swishing. But it doesn't actually refer to anything. It refers to a sound. And they didn't like this explanation because it wasn't a translation of something material. But you know, I found it was interesting that they had this. They wanted this confirmation, and I write in the book that this made me think about my own short history. I was born in Massachusetts, outside Boston. Massachusetts is a Native American name. It never occurred to me to wonder what it meant. You know, growing up, I found it difficult to spell, and that bugged me. And we're surrounded in North America by native names, and we rarely ask what they mean. So this was I actually recommended this form of belonging awkwardly, as I called it. I recommended it to North American whites. And so yeah, the sense of belonging and entitlement was not rock solid. It was not airtight.
Okay, just one final point before I go on to issues around white depiction of blacks and rather than of landscape. I mean, at any time, this idea or imagine a project in which the black population was imagined as not existing as such, or not of any significance, that they imagine the black population away, so to speak. Is there any basis for claiming that was at least initially tied to the argument or view that black people were somehow existed outside, beyond humanity, and part of nature, brute nature, so to speak?
Yeah, I mean, so I didn't get into all of ideologies, explicit ideologies of racism in the book very much. What you might call scientific racism, wherein there might be a hierarchy of subtypes of humans, some of which are closer to apes. And the reason I didn't get into those theories is I actually didn't find anybody articulating them. People would use the occasional slur word. Often the older people used it with me, and then their children being 30 and 40 years old, would criticize them for it. And it turned out, it would turn out often, you know, when you show up as an American, even in 2000 in these circumstances, people hold you responsible for Jimmy Carter passing sanctions against Rhodesia and some of this stuff, which is now really far in the past. So there was a certain kind of performance of racism or anti-racism for the American. This is the kind of stuff anthropologists love to get into this kind of reflexive stuff. But I didn't find people particularly attached to a whole ideology and mental model of racism. That sort of thing fit within the administrative project. If you want to exploit people, it's helpful to declare them to be inferior in one way or another. There were certain assumptions that went unchallenged, like wage rates in the farms were very low, and the farmer always made enough money to buy a new truck every year or two of the latest kind of double cab. And it went unquestioned that he was going to have a standard of living so far above what his workers enjoyed. And you could only really justify that by saying that, and this is something people would occasionally say, the workers needed less, the workers got less because they needed less, because they could live on nothing was an expression. They could live on nothing, you know? And it was almost said with admiration sometimes for the kind of hardiness of the African worker who just needed a bowl of sadza or something. But I didn't find a great deal of, certainly not among writers, photographers, and so on, didn't find a great deal of stake being put in racial hierarchies. Which is why I came up with this new term to describe the white attitude towards blacks at that time as other disregarding. Which is to signify that I didn't find whites hating blacks. I didn't find whites considering them very actively as an inferior subspecies. I mostly found them not thinking and not wanting to think a great deal about blacks, certainly not in their free time of leisure, which was for the imaginative project. And the reason, if I can continue here, the reason I emphasize this other disregarding is that, I mean, you know, one can criticize white Zimbabweans, especially in the farming sector, all one wants, and that's no longer really relevant because they don't have power. Their power has, in a certain sense, migrated over to the tourism sector globally, which is now a leading force of displacement and constraint on smallholder farmers, indigenous people, and so on. And so what I wanted to see is what's the continuity from white settler society into the management and partition of nature, the claiming of nature, by these elites in tourism and conservation. And so that other disregarding attitude is characteristic of national parks, ecotourism, all sorts of heavily capitalized leisure pursuits that pretend the landscape is empty of people, and therefore actually end up emptying the landscape of people through eviction and exclusion.
No, thank you for that, David. I'm actually going to refer to the quotation where you mentioned other disregarding. You argue that, in my account, whites seek less to dominate blacks and more to find for themselves a secure place in Zimbabwe. And then you go on to argue they were conservationists first and racists second, or perhaps they were not racist at all. This is not racism, but other disregarding. So I'm just trying to think of the white commercial farms and Blair Rutherford's notion of domestic government in which there was that coercive side to it, but also very paternalistic elements, in which the farmer, as you mentioned, the farmer was typically the male, and the farmer's wife was involved in this paternalistic sort of pastoral care for the workers as well. So I'm not too sure how. I mean, Blair Rutherford's book came out, I think, 2001 on domestic government. But is this sort of paternalistic image of the farm laborer needing their care, is that in any way consistent with or in any way aligns to your imaginative project, or the White's imaginative project about caring for nature?
Well, so the reason I distinguish, maybe, and I hope this is a way of reconciling my work with Blair's, which I have a great deal of respect for Blair and that book and his other work on commercial farm workers. There's this administrative project I described, and everything that Blair describes going on, including education and in some cases evangelism, carried out by the male farm owner or the female farm owner's wife and various staff. All that happened. There was, of course, less of it happening after 2000 because things were so militarized, and in fact, there were quite some tensions between farm workers and farm owners, and more tensions than before because of split loyalties after the farm invasions. But what I found is that the farmers whom I spent most of my time with, I spent very little time with farm workers because of those tensions. I couldn't really operate on both sides of the boundary. They didn't identify with that paternalism. They didn't identify with the things they had done, which they would say were good things for the benefit of farm workers. So again, they were imagining a kind of Africa where there weren't really farm workers or many Africans at all, a kind of Kariba-like imagination. And that doesn't discount all of what was happening in terms of administration, management, exploitation, whatever you want to call it. But it wasn't actually the form of belonging that they crafted for themselves. And you may say this is a very generous account. The job of the anthropologist, when your subjects are white commercial farmers, the job of the anthropologist is to kind of climb into their head and figure out what makes them tick, what their values are, what they think about, what they hope for. And this was important because I was writing a book that I hoped would have resonance for whites in the United States, whites in Australia, New Zealand, Canada, maybe, for these kind of neo-Europes. So I wrote what I thought was the most generous or compassionate account of white Zimbabweans ever written by somebody that was not a white Zimbabwean. But it was more critical than the vast literature that white Zimbabweans have written about themselves. The book, actually, the conclusions were largely rejected by white Zimbabwean critics and readers, as far as I can tell, and embraced by a lot of other people. So that's the way it goes. But I do think there is value in interpreting people on their own terms if you wish to communicate with them and reform this population. The population, however, was disappearing as I was writing. So that goal I didn't really achieve.
So, I mean, is the administrative project ultimately in tension with the imaginative project, and sort of hinders the possibility of that imaginative project actually being fully realized, or at least securing the belonging and well-being of whites insofar as that administrative project is retained, whether at national level, say pre-1980, then at farm level, post-1980 amongst the white commercial farmers.
Well,
Sort of
yes, I mean,
minister project, yeah.
I think
Continue.
that's what happened. So there were two kinds of people who cared about Kariba in the book. There were the commercial farmers who liked to go there on holiday with their families and so on, as you described. And then there were a whole kind of disorganized passel of photographers and painters and writers who lived largely in Harare and some in South Africa. And they didn't own land. I mean, they owned nice houses and things, but they didn't own agricultural estates. They didn't employ or exploit farm laborers. They were not directly affected by any of land reform or violence from the government. And they were free and still are free to hop in their cars and drive to Kariba and look at the waterscape and imagine themselves as whites in wild Africa. And from the point of view of their imaginative project may be very well intact. The tension was trying to own a big chunk of Africa and run it and exclude others from the benefits of it, while claiming that your identity was as some kind of explorer in a wild terrain. And it was ultimately the former. It was the contradictions of the former and the government's intolerance, rightful intolerance of the former, that overwhelmed the ability of whites to enjoy the latter. And those people from the commercial farms, one of the things that fascinated me about them is that they would say, as their farms were invaded and so on, and they were losing access to their tobacco barns and things, and they were saying, we're going to have to leave. There's no place for us here. And I'd say, well, what do you mean leave? And they'd say, we're going to have to leave Zimbabwe. We're making plans to go to Australia. And there's no place for us in this country. And I'd say, well, this would be hard conversations to have. Well, you could just be less wealthy in Zimbabwe. Like, all right, the state is taking your farm. That feels absolutely terrible. I know. But you could be like me and live in a pretty nice house in a nice urban neighborhood, and you'll have your double cab in the driveway, and you'll do pretty well because, of course, they had externalized funds, they had overseas accounts, they had all these resources and things which they were going to bring to Australia with them. I'd say, bring it to Harare with you, and you can go to Kariba on the holidays. And they just couldn't stomach being poorer, not being poor, but just being a little bit poorer, less wealthy in Zimbabwe. It wasn't a class position. Some of them did. Some of them did in the short term move to Marondera or Harare. But a lot of them just wanted to be landowners somewhere. And that's probably unfortunate because they couldn't negotiate themselves into the position that the white photographers and so on had been in all along.
Just one final question. Thank you for that, David. What were the age of the white commercial farmers that you're interviewing? I'm just wondering what generation they were. The 60s or 20s, 30s, the younger generation, or.
Before, just to save time, I do have something to say about the contemporary. I told you at the beginning I didn't have much to update it, but I do have one thing to update with before we close. The ages of them, mostly late 20s to 70s. So these were, and intergenerational farms and so on. The older people were retiring. The younger people were in a massive quandary because they didn't think they'd be able to go on farming, and they would have liked their kids, who were either unborn so far or pretty young. They would like their kids to continue farming, but it seemed like their kids were not going to continue farming. One of the astonishing things about white commercial farmers in Rhodesia and then in Zimbabwe is that they were, I believe, the most successful family-owned farms in the world. Largely because they were able to negotiate with agricultural capital a very advantageous deal in the form of the tobacco auction floors. And that deal with agricultural capital no longer exists. And the replacement A1 and A2 farmers are much less successful in that kind of class struggle, if you want to put it that way.
Okay. Was that the point you're going to raise about the contemporary issue?
Well, so I just after an absence of many years, because as I said, the government made it impossible to do research. But I went back on a mostly personal visit last month.
Yeah.
And I didn't get to the commercial farms because all my subjects are gone from them. I spent 2 weekends in Harare. This is only 2 weekends. But one of the things that struck me was the kind of absence of whites just in public space, with the possible exception of the kind of Borrowdale Chisipede nucleus. And I found, possibly because of the absence of whites, just a lot more Shona spoken. In places of business where Black people would have normally spoken English. And I found people speaking Shona to me, and something happened. I speak Shona, so it's fine. I can respond. But I found something happened to me that never happened before, which is that I pulled up in the double cab I'd rented, pulled up to a filling station, and the guy greeted me in Shona, and I greeted him back. And I said something like Chimbo Zadzai Tangi Ne Peturo. And, and we had this whole conversation in Shona. And afterwards I said, why did you speak to me in Shona instead of English? And he didn't even seem surprised by any of this. And he said, well, it's Harare, we speak Shona and all this. And, so there is a kind of Africanization of Harare that's happened, which is more egalitarian, I would say. And I found that pretty refreshing. And it gets back to, again, the tremendous weakness in the way in which whites failed to appreciate their minority status and the kind of burden that imposed, and the arrogance of thinking that the majority would learn English just to get along with whites. And that really blew up in a lot of people's faces. So I don't know, there may be a way, and then people have written about the way in South Africa too, the way extra-European minorities can kind of learn from Zimbabwe and learn this form of what I call belonging awkwardly. This is the real takeaway from the book for other places is that there's a kind of arrogance of ownership, an arrogance of elites, which is entirely unnecessary to be an elite. And that a little bit of insecurity on everybody's part creates the need to negotiate, to compromise, to learn another person's language, and ultimately to relativize one's status. And so I suppose that's the message, is recognize the extent to which you and your lineage are foreign, which is possibly true for the majority of the world at this point, because there has been so much movement in the 20th century, and acknowledge forebears on that landscape and their descendants on that landscape, and feel yourself a little bit indebted to them.
David, I think that's a great way to end off our conversation. So I'd like to thank you for discussing your book, Whiteness in Zimbabwe. And we look forward to engaging with you hopefully in the future. And I'm sure that our listeners will think carefully about what you've said, and particularly your concluding comments. So really thank you very much, David. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Kirk. And thank you, Josh, as well. It was a pleasure.
Okay.
Yes,
Take care.
so much. Yes.
Bye-bye.
Take care, David. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Okay. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.